Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with pesto. That's right, it's recently come to my attention that we've never posted a video for a proper pesto. Oh, we've done a few tragically hip versions, using things like arugula and walnuts and almonds and parsley, but we've never actually posted a real fresh basil pesto. And not only are we doing a real pesto in regards to the ingredients, but what really makes this a real pesto is the technique. And in particular, using one of these instead of a blender or food processor. Okay, if you're only going to remember one thing from this video, it should be that the only way to make a real pesto is using a mortar and pestle. And ideally, it's one of these relatively inexpensive marble versions, which I think have just the right amount of texture for this process. And I'll give more info about this must-have tool on the blog post. But for now, let's go ahead and get started by reviewing our ingredients. Starting with the star of the show, our basil. And as far as a buying tip, try to find a bunch that's flowering or is about to flower, since my Ligurian friends tell me that's going to make for the most fragrant and best tasting pesto. And then besides the basil, we're also going to need some peeled garlic cloves. And I'll generally use between 4 and 6 cloves, depending on my mood. We're also going to need 2 ounces of real Parmesan cheese. And the reason I'm giving you weight here is because, as you'll see in a second, cup measurements for grated cheese don't work very well. But anyway, we'll get to that in a second. We are also going to need some pine nuts, which in my opinion should be raw and not toasted. And then other than a little bit of salt, the only other thing we're going to need is some beautiful extra virgin olive oil, preferably from Liguria, but any mild flavored extra virgin olive oil will work. And besides picking all the basil leaves off our bunches, the one thing we're going to want to do before we get started here is grate our cheese, which I normally don't show, but today I have a reason. And that's to demonstrate that 2 ounces of grated cheese is not a half cup, which is what it's most commonly listed as on your online conversion charts. No, if you take 2 ounces of Parmigiano Reggiano and grate it on a microplane, you're going to end up with something closer to 1.5 cups of grated cheese. So bottom line, we're going to weigh out exactly 2 ounces. And then once that's set and our basil is picked, we can begin by crushing our garlic in our mortar with the help of a large pinch of coarse kosher salt, or sea salt, really doesn't matter. It's the coarseness that's the important part, since that's going to help us grind these garlic cloves down to a paste. And as you may know, by crushing garlic like this instead of chopping it, even if you use a blender or food processor, the flavor of garlic pulverized like this is so much more intense and sharp and peppery that it really is an entirely different product. And one of the real keys to this recipe. So we'll crush our garlic as shown, at which point we can start adding our basil. But unlike what most recipes tell you to do, we're not adding ours a few leaves at a time. That's crazy. I much prefer to add it in 3 or 4 larger additions. So basically the bottom line here is put in as much basil as you can fit in, and we'll pound that until it starts to break down, at which point we'll add another handful and simply continue on until it's all incorporated. And while it might be a little unruly when you start, and you may have to retrieve a few leaves that attempt to escape, I do prefer this method because I think the more you have in the mortar, the easier it is to crush. And while technically we're just using the leaves here, as I'm smashing this you might see a little piece of flower here, or a little piece of stem there. That's fine, nothing to be concerned about. Those little pieces of stem are more fibrous, but the flavor is basically the same as the leaf. And as far as the flowers go, a little bit of bud doesn't hurt. But anyway, one way or another, we're going to add and crush our basil, and continue working it over until we have a fairly fine paste. And right here you can get a look at exactly how far I like to go. So we will crush our basil as fine as we see fit, at which point we can add and pound in our pine nuts, which as I mentioned before are raw and not toasted. And then what we'll do once our pine nuts have been mashed in is move on to our grated cheese. And similar to our basil, I like to add this in about 3 additions. So we'll transfer a handful in and work that over with our pestle. Yes, the T is silent. And as you know, generally I tell you to use whatever cheese you want, but not here. I highly suggest you go with the Parmigiano Reggiano, and not the pecorino that's called for in a lot of recipes. Because while it is true pecorino is used in authentic versions back in the old country, the variety of pecorino they're using is not the same as the one you buy here, which I find is a little too sharp and salty for my taste. So I think a Parmigiano Reggiano is the way to go. But having said that, do what you want. You are, after all, the boss in making sure your pesto is the besto and better than the resto. And by the way, it's during this cheese addition that our pesto actually starts to look like pesto. I mean, how is something that looks like that not going to be incredible to eat? But anyway, we'll go ahead and mash and muddle in 2 ounces of Parmesan, which brings us to our last ingredient, about 1/2 cup of extra virgin olive oil, which we'll mix in about 1 tablespoon at a time. And I mentioned earlier to use Ligurian olive oil if you could find it. And that's because it tends to be on the mild side. Okay, with the peppery intensity of that garlic, we don't necessarily want a really intense, sharp, peppery olive oil, which can sort of fight the garlic. So if you're not using Ligurian, try to find something nice and mild on the buttery side, and not towards the bitter peppery end of the spectrum. And as soon as we've successfully emulsified in that oil, our pesto is done. And looking beyond gorgeous. Speaking of which, above and beyond the taste, you can really only achieve this amazing appearance if you use the mortar and pestle. And if we want, we could serve it right out of the mortar, which does look very cool. But I actually transferred mine to this bowl so that I could show you I like to drizzle a little bit extra olive oil over the top to, I think, protect it from oxidizing. Although, to be honest, I'm not sure it's necessary. Okay, this could be another classic example of me doing something that just seems like a good idea. But anyway, that's what I do. And then speaking of good ideas, let me move this bowl next to some even better light, as well as next to some sliced bread so I can taste it. And as luck would have it, the sun was just coming out from behind a cloud, so we get to see this amazing amalgamation in even better light. And since this is a raw, uncooked sauce, for me that's how it's best enjoyed. And if you've only had pesto from the store, or one made using a food processor or blender, you are not going to believe how much better this is. This stuff's so much more fragrant, and the flavors are so pure and so intense, to compare the two products is almost ridiculous. And yes, since I dripped on that other slice, I'll have to eat that too. But anyway, in this chef's opinion, this stuff's best enjoyed raw. But if you do want to enjoy it with pasta, which is not a bad idea, do not heat it in the pan. Okay, add some to the bottom of a warm pasta bowl, along with a little bit of extra olive oil, and then we'll transfer our cooked pasta on top of that, along with a little bit of that starchy pasta water, and maybe a little extra pesto on top. And we will toss that right in the bowl. Okay, if we added that pesto to the pan and cooked it into the pasta like we do with other sauces, it would completely lose that freshness and vibrancy. Which is not to say it's going to be bad. It's just not going to be otherworldly like the raw stuff. So once made, if you want to use it for a pizza, or for pasta like this, not a problem. But at least promise me you're going to try it raw before you do that, okay? Which reminds me, fair warning. About 3 out of 10 people will not consider this an upgrade from what they get at the market. This stuff will actually be too intense for some people. Okay, when it comes to pesto sauces, this stuff is the truth. And as we all know, not everybody can handle the truth. But for the 7 out of 10 people that can handle this, they're going to love it as much as I do. So I hope sometime soon you find some basil and pull out your mortar and pestle. Or if you don't have one, this is the perfect excuse to order one. And give this amazing fresh basil pesto a try soon. So head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.